Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Welcome again to the Business of America. I'm Jerry Rogers. We have a great show lined up for you today. We're going to talk a little bit about China, the economy, and a new report. I like reports. I like data. I like information. I like the truth. I like facts. I think the best way to make public policy, the best way to run a business, the best way to run your family household is to know what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's not true. And so joining us today is Adam Savit. He is the director of China, the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute, AFPI. Adam, welcome to the Business of America.
Jerry, thanks so much.
The premise here, the ethos of the podcast is it's the Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to point fingers, blame. But what we want to do here is highlight those individuals, the men and women who are in the arena, advocating, doing the hard research, the entrepreneurs, right? The startup firms, the men and women who are doing something. So we highlight the doers here. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of misinformation, a term the left loves, misinformation. The media loves that term. But there really is a lot of misinformation or maybe a lack of information about China, our relationship with China, how China does business. And I know that you have a report that came out. I might get this wrong, but it's genocide decoupling.
That's right.
Breaking the slave labor supply chains that enabled fast fashion. Now, the Super Bowl was recently. There were a lot of commercials. And one of the commercials, I think 5, 6, 7 times, was one of these fast fashion enterprises. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure, that's correct. Well, that one is Temu. This report covers two of those enterprises, which are the largest ones. Shein, kind of spelled like shine. Some of your viewers may have seen that. And Temu, exactly. Now, Shein is 100% clothing, fast fashion, cheap products. You see these pop up on mostly on Instagram and TikTok, although Temu did launch at last year's Super Bowl. That was a sort of big debut. They're a little latecomer compared to Shein. And of course, they do have traditional advertising as well, as they did blitz the Super Bowl, so to speak.
Sure.
But a lot of this is showing up on TikTok. A lot of the advertisement is on Instagram, all of the socials, but especially TikTok, where they're cultivating a young user base who, a $4 dress, literally, things like that, a $2 t-shirt. So it's actually encouraging sort of a disposable culture in fashion and otherwise. It's a match with the disposable, quick few second TikTok culture as well. And they rely on TikTok and Instagram influencers to push their products. So they'll pay the person in front of the camera a little bit to plug Shein or Temu to show some of their apparel that they're wearing and this sort of thing. So and also to point out, this is a huge industry. So Shein is the biggest one. In 2019, they had $3 billion in revenue. Then go through the pandemic, when, of course, all online sales skyrocketed. They were up to $30 billion. And they have a IPO in the waiting. They have been talking about it since November. But once that kicks in and estimate it for valuation, some people have been saying $100 billion. So this is serious business.
So where do the products come from? Why are they so cheap? It's interesting. So I watched the Super Bowl with my family, and I have 4 daughters, a son, but my 3 older daughters are 23, 22, and 17. And when the commercial came on for Temu, am I saying that right?
Temu, yeah.
Temu, yeah. When that commercial came on, all 3 of my older daughters said, "Slave labor, Dad, slave labor." Uh-huh. And again, I was I was unfamiliar. I knew, I did a little bit of research before this interview, but it was kind of striking that my kids knew this. So talk about the products and why did they say slave labor, and why are these products so inexpensive?
Well, it's heartening to hear that your daughters already knew that. That means that the ideas are penetrating. And also, thank you for plugging the idea of a research report, because it is long and a little bit boring. But we try to distill it down, and those policies are important. How we're actually going to tackle them. But as far as the slave labor, yes. So this is the western region of China, Xinjiang, and the people there are majority Uyghur or other Turkic Muslim peoples who are majority barely in the province, but a tiny minority within China. Now, this region is incredibly productive with cotton. It accounts for a quarter of the entire world's cotton, if you can believe it. So it's just very attuned to that. It's either great soil or great climate, something like that. So unfortunately, the Uyghurs there, viewers probably have heard because both the Trump and Biden administrations termed what's going on in Xinjiang a genocide, where the majority Han Chinese are sort of being settled in there, and they're repressing the religion, the Islamic religion of those people locally. What they're also doing is using slave labor. Perhaps 100,000 of the million Uyghurs who have been locked up have been engaged in slave labor, and that includes harvesting this cotton. In some cases, making the garments, but most of the garments are made in the port cities over on the coast of China and are then shipped out. But the fact of these slave supply chains is part of what makes this clothing, and in the case of Temu, also gadgets. They have drones and little copters and whatnot, and electronics. But that's what makes these things so cheap.
I'm in Washington, D.C. I think we're both in Washington, D.C. And there's lots of legislation. I remember, every so often there's a, Made in America Act. There's Protect American Manufacturing Acts. My point is that Congress is always ready to legislate something. So is there now legislation? Are there policy discussions in Washington, D.C. To deal with the slave labor product line, because it's inherently unfair. Look, it's unjust, it's immoral, but also the U.S. has manufacturing, and so do our allies, and so this seems that we're actually, if we allow these sales, then we're giving right now our geopolitical enemy. China, God bless them, but they are a rival, to say the least, a rival. Is there anything happening policy-wise to check this?
Well, yeah. First of all, you have a great point, which is that on America First grounds, put aside the slave labor part. Well, we never should put it aside. But let's say, yes, it is sort of a case of dumping. It's a case of undercutting American producers and retailers. But there is Congress, elected officials have highlighted that, and they have proposed laws along those lines. What this report focuses on, though, is mainly the slave labor part. So, just like with a lot of China-related issues, there has been a rising consciousness, including within Congress, especially the Congressional Executive Commission on China, the CECC. They hold hearings on a variety of topics. They do hold hearings on Uyghur issues and on fast fashion. And they were instrumental in helping to build the research and the background to introduce something, the UFPLA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. UFLPA. Okay. So that went into effect in 2022. That has some features in it that are important. Number one, it has a designated list of the producers within Xinjiang. And again, this isn't only cotton. This goes to metals and other things that go into other sorts of sectors and manufacturing. But as far as that law, it's had some trouble, right? Like with a lot of laws that passed. So the enforcement has been difficult. It falls to Customs and Border Patrol, but they only have a certain amount of...
It's not like our border is running smoothly right now, and points of entry, and it's so my goodness, wow.
Yeah, that's correct. We're not dealing with the millions of people that are coming across the border. Forget about these packages, and but they're just not properly resourced, and they're not given the leeway to do what they need to do. To give you an idea of the scale, 685 million packages came in under what's called the de minimis. Now, here's a dorky thing, but a policy we need to get into because it really enables the entire fast fashion business. So the de minimis threshold was a law that came out actually in the 1930s. They set a $5 threshold for imports. The de minimis means that these goods are so cheap that it's not worth the government to inspect them and tariff them because they're so cheap, just let them in. Now, in the 1930s, $5, this was affecting people who were coming home from Europe with some souvenirs and this sort of thing, and hey, brush them through and this sort of thing, or small personal packages, gifts, this sort of thing. Fast forward about 60 years later, in the 90s, they bumped that up to $200 minimum threshold. So, and that was supposed to, and it did, enable online commerce. That first wave of online commerce, including Amazon, it allowed those shipments, mostly from China, to come in. And if they were under that $200 threshold, they were not inspected, they were not tariffed, etc. Now that bumped up again to $800, and it's unclear why on earth you would have to do that. Now that lets in nearly any package that's going to be coming in, including the Shein and the Temu and all of the fast fashion brands. But something like a third of the packages that come in under de minimis, so in 2022, 200 million packages we're talking about, are from Shein and Temu. And they're never inspected because practically you can't really do it. They don't fill out the form or whatever it is, and it's assumed that that material coming in on a storage ship from China is filled with all these individual orders that Americans get, and they're all under $800, so they get in.
It's interesting. The Chinese communist government seems to do things that benefit the Chinese communist government, whether it's in economics or state corporatism, military, their own borders, whatever. It seems to me equally that our own government doesn't always do what's beneficial to the American economy, to the American household, to our own sense of American values and American principles. Do you address that? How do we address that? I guess raise awareness. We're doing that here on this podcast, but it just seems to me that we're not governed well, especially when it comes to our relationship, our strategic relationship with China. What do you think?
I think you're right. Now, this is one of the pluses and minuses of living in a free society where corporations are able to sort of behave as they see fit with some regulations. But generally speaking, we don't want our government to come down and regulate what businesses are doing, even foreign businesses, if they're making a good product and they're selling it here and that's helping Americans. But, starting in the 90s or the early 2000s, the Chinese, their exports came to completely dominate our sales here in the United States. And because of that, finally, the consciousness rose, especially with the Trump campaign and the America First movement, the populist movement, that, hey, that TV being $200 less is actually hurting American families and hurting people that need to work and put bread on the table. So is that exchange worth it? So, Trump was the first one who really went after China with punitive measures. A lot of it was tariffing and other regulations on Chinese imports. So, yeah, it's a relatively new thing in American politics. Thankfully, the Trump administration did take it seriously. And you could argue that those penalties and those tariffs in many ways brought China to the table, or at least sort of brought them to heel with the most abusive practices. But yeah, this is, again, China, if they want to have an import ban, and by the way, they have a de minimis, most countries do, their de minimis is $7 and ours is $800. So they're protecting their imports. They don't want competition in their country. But, Americans, and especially those right of center, are skeptical of government intervention. And we all understand that. But yes, that puts us at a disadvantage in a way to China.
And it's frustrating too. And again, you're the expert here, but it seems to me that our government interferes in the market all the time. Look at that. Look at healthcare. Look at consumer goods. The EPA. Look at the FDA. I mean, my goodness, we have lots of government doing lots of things all the time. But here's an area where it seems to me the government should be intervening, and they're not. So, I want to ask you this. We hear a lot about free trade. Look, I'm a market guy. I like markets. I believe in the willing seller, the willing buyer. I like relationships that are governed by the individual or even the organization. But the fact of the matter is, what we call, or what some in our city, what some in DC call free trade, is anything but free trade. And do you address this? I mean, I know the China Policy Initiative must address it, but is that connected to your paper, to this issue? How we define free trade, in my mind, is very often not free trade.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, this paper isn't 100% focused on that. Of course, those issues come in, like the shipping,
Sure,
the de minimis, and that sort of thing. But yes, in the bigger scheme of things, Robert Lighthizer, who was the United States trade rep under Trump and is actually associated with AFPI as a chair of our Center for Trade, wrote a book, and it's called "No Trade is Free." He is a severe advocate of the tariffs. He had a lot to do with the tariffs coming in, and yes, I think the Trump administration has moved that window a little bit, where Americans are a little more comfortable with putting those punitive measures on a country like China, and sort of, I don't want to say bending our rules, because I'm a market guy too, like you, but the rules have to be fair. Within the U.S., you have a rule of law and standardized customs of business where the free market absolutely works. But then when you go outside the boundaries, we see what we saw in the last 3 decades, which is that we're enriching China, which is an adversary, which is building their military. Yeah. And yes, we have some sort of intervention is unfortunately needed on our end.
You mentioned when we started that during COVID, during the pandemic, because of the lockdowns, there was a lot of online commerce, a lot of online business. And again, just in the context of this conversation, what we also discovered during the pandemic was the mom and pop shops were shut down. Main Street America was shut down, but the box stores and the larger entities remained open and actually did pretty well. So do the policies enacted now toward China, do they benefit more kind of the international corporation versus nearby here, Frederick, Maryland, shop local. They have all these, hardware stores and florists and little shops. It seems to me that our trade policy with China benefits the big international business corporation, but in many ways hurts the mom and pop shops. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's just undeniably true, and let's look.
But it's funny. You say it's undeniably true, but there are members of Congress who will just dismiss what I just said out of hand sometimes.
Well, I don't want to cast any aspersions, and I won't. I'm not mentioning any specific names, but let's say.
And it's bipartisan, right? It's both.
It is.
It's both Democrats and Republicans who are in this mode.
That's true, because what this gets back to is the shift with Trump, because basically for a long period there was a great broad bipartisan consensus on that issue, because Republicans, and we can call them Chamber of Commerce Republicans, who just default to this free international system where corporations are sort of international entities that have no particular loyalty or respect for the United States, and the trade, generally speaking, is crushing small businesses. Again, specifically with fast fashion, the sheer scale of it is crazy. And you got Amazon in there as well. But on the clothing side, this has got to be destroying local businesses. I don't have the numbers, but there's no question that it is. So yeah.
Well, let's go back to again watching these Super Bowl commercials, and my older daughters, like my son who's 9 had no idea what any of it was, and I have another young daughter. But my older girls, right away, all 3 of them, and not because one said it. It was almost in unison. And I'm involved in policy and politics, so they're like, "Dad, slave labor." How would they know that? Like, how would my girls? How is this becoming more people becoming more aware of this?
Again, I'll say I'm really heartened by that, and I mean, I think they're out ahead. They must be doing reading, and I'm sure they also are interested in politics.
They do live in my house, so.
All right, yeah, exactly. They're also interested in what you are, and you bring it home.
But there has to be something. Maybe I know younger folks today, the Gen Z, millennial, but Gen Zers are very sensitive to these kinds of issues, and I'm wondering if we can leverage that. People say that. Young voters, this is the future. We have to get young voters excited. It seems to me this is an issue where young voters in particular would be excited.
You're hitting on something right here, because China is sort of one of those cases where the ideologies sort of break down left and right, because yes, many people on the left are often proclaiming they're for minority rights and they're against exploitation like this. I mean, part of the problem is just that China is so strong and huge and has such a clampdown on their internal situation. It's very difficult to intervene there without some, I'm not going to say military, but maybe eventually, unfortunately, that might be the case, or some other harsh measures. So, if you have these young activists, teenagers or in college or, that age range, it's even harder to latch into than most causes, because there are so many factors going against you. The media, including the social media, of course, and TikTok is wildly biased. There have been studies done by my colleagues here at AFPI that conclusively that TikTok moved the needle with young people on the Israel-Gaza war. So, if that kicks into action, for example, if God forbid China does attack Taiwan, they're going to, rev that right up into action and use that TikTok again to influence the young minds against our own country. And you can see it happening because also there was a TikTok trend where they were reading the Osama bin Laden's message to the United States.
Yes, I remember this, sure.
Yes, and these people were identifying with it because, okay, many of them were too young to be aware of what was happening to them, but also just Osama's statements fit very well with the left-wing critique of the United States, anti-capitalism and pointing out racism. And that's what these young people are being indoctrinated with. Now, I'm sure there are some, as evidenced by your family, that can see beyond that. And I think there is backlash, even on the apps. And at least they're not totally censored. I think these opinions are going around about slave labor. But again, like with a lot of things, just like the NBA, which censors its players for speaking out against China. Yes. It's the money. It's the money. And China is too big of a producer and exporter of all of these things. And that's why we advocate strategic decoupling of our economies. Not decoupling. We can't magically get rid of all these cheap things that are made in China, but we start with the dangerous sectors, the AI, the microchips, etc., that they can use in their military.
So 2 questions. Explain again for us, for our listeners. And again, our viewers are those who are plugged in to business and politics, and so these are folks who kind of already understand these issues, at least from a 30,000-foot level. So I want you to explain strategic decoupling, but then also, we talked about the paper, but what are the key takeaways from it? So so we understand this, and I'm going to make this paper available. I'm the editor at Real Clear Policy,
right.
And we have a research section. I want to make sure that the paper goes up this afternoon. So if our viewers want to will read it, they can read it at Real Clear Policy, also at the AFPI site, of course. But I think this is an important paper to read for lots of different reasons. But again, strategic decoupling, and then what are the major takeaways?
Sure. So strategic decoupling, again, is no one, even someone like a Lighthizer who's really tough on the issue, can expect that we can extricate ourselves from China because we have hundreds of billions of dollars in trade going on. So, and these range from things like the clothing, which for the slave part, we do need to act on that quickly, but also cheap electronics and other things that we can't magically offshore that, to, for example, Southeast Asia, which is a place, Vietnam, and where some of this stuff, they're trying to move the production out. But what we need to start with, and actually give credit when it's due, the Biden administration did just enact an executive order which would regulate outbound foreign investment into China on critical sectors, again, AI, microchips, anything with a defense dual-use capability. But that needs to be broadened out and with better enforcement. But it's on the right track. As far as what to do about the slave labor supply chains, so there is a body that a task force. Again, we're getting into DC bureaucrat mode here, but it's interagency. The CBP is part of it. And the thing is, and again, we don't want to put more money into government, but this is an important one. We need to fund that out so that I can fund agents and people doing the research to plug these holes in order to do that. Number two, I mentioned the de minimis threshold. That is key. That's what enabled this entire thing, because under $800, and when is it ever going to go that high, especially when you're buying cheap clothing and other gadgets. That is what is enabling this entire thing. And 685 million packages came in under de minimis. Wow. It's hard to get your head around. So that is
when did the $800 threshold? When did that come into effect?
I'm going to forget the exact year, but it's in the 2000s. So it went up to 200.
So in the last 10 or so years.
Yes, it went up to 200 in the 90s and 800 recently. Yes.
Okay.
So there's a few things you can do with that. You can straight out remove it. You can lower it back to $200. But here's the thing: there's always trade-offs. Now, listen, if we remove it completely, we're going to need a lot more inspections of international packages. Yeah. It is going to become more expensive. It is more cumbersome. But these are the trade-offs we need to look at in this situation. Another possibility is reciprocity. We always underline that the relationship with China and any power should be reciprocal. So, like I said, China has a $7 de minimis on their side. Let's make that $7. The only one that's close to us is, I think, Europe also has around 200. So maybe we could bring it down to that. And
so is the U.S. then one of the highest in the world at $800?
I haven't done all the research, but it has to be. It has to be.
It has to be. Okay, yeah. We can speculate a little bit. Don't worry about it.
Yes, I'll say maybe Tuvalu or some Pacific island has a higher. No, I don't know. But yeah, that's another. Well, yeah, and the third thing is banning the actual apps, because like TikTok, these depend on the App Store. And that depends on that availability in order to order those clothes that teenagers are ordering. So, and this is another dicey thing with targeting corporations, and that's why TikTok is still available in the United States. And so it's a hard question. How do you frame this? How do you get those two companies without hurting the freedom of American companies? But, for example, India banned dozens of Chinese apps after a border clash where Indian soldiers died. They banned TikTok. They banned WeChat, and you cannot get.
They banned these apps by legislation, or by fiat.
Yeah, I don't know if it was an equivalent of an executive order or legislation. I'm not sure.
Yeah, right. It seems to me that again that some combination of public action, appropriate public action, but also private pressure. Very often, and I've been in DC now for 2 decades, the best reforms, the best changes in policy is usually some combination of private sector competition or discipline with government boundaries or safety. And maybe that's something here where we could address it both from the private sector and also because, listen, I don't want to be in business with an app that depends upon slave labor. I mean, there is that approach. Is there anything right now in the policy realm to address this? Is there legislation? Has the Biden administration, its trade representative, its trade policy folks, have they looked at this? Is there talk? What's the current the current status?
I agree with you. The private-public partnership is the best way to do it. As far as, here's the problem. Actually, there's an example with the Confucius Institutes that used to exist on college campuses.
Yes.
We tried to put legislation in the states. It actually came down to pressure. America doesn't have any laws in the books banning Confucius Institutes, but they were exposed, and activists in local communities got them pushed out. So that's a great example. I think the big difference here is that university students weren't flush with billions of dollars. And also, they weren't providing a service like super cheap clothing, which when people are browsing, it's just like the bottom line. And of course, we have an inflation problem. It's like you have to clothe the kids or yourself, and a $10 dress looks great. That's, I think, the biggest problem. And there is legislation that's along the lines of the regulations that I talked about. So it's trying to solidify either the de minimis or adding companies to the entity list of the slave labor. But it's, it needs to have teeth. If these corporations feel the bite, that's when they're going to stop. And if they're not held to account like that, they're going to go for the profit. And so that's that.
Yeah. I'm telling you what, I've read your paper. I'm familiar with some of the testimony you've given recently. You're doing very important work. AFPI is doing very important work. We'll make sure over at Real Clear Policy that we highlight it. I know that the Federal Newswire also, from this podcast, there'll be news items and other such things. But please stay in touch with us. Send us material. You and I are now acquainted. You have my email. I have your email. Make sure that I stay on top of the good work that you're doing. Before we go, is there anything that, because you know better than I, that I didn't ask, something that has to get out, or did we cover it well until the next show? We have to do this again. But anything that we should have hit on that we didn't?
On the fast fashion, I think we hit it. We hit it pretty well.
Good.
But what I'd emphasize, and what actually the House China Committee is focusing on now, is the outbound investment and the venture capital that empowers China. So that's something people need to read up on.
Okay, well, and you know what? We're going to do a part 2 of this, maybe part 3 and a part 4. But Adam, I appreciate your time, and I really, again, as a policy guy, as a dad, as someone who cares for his country, I appreciate very much the good work that you're doing. So that's it. That's another episode in the books of the business of America, highlighting the doers, highlighting those who are in the arena. And of course, Adam Savit is such an individual in the arena. So again, Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream